Chapter 10 Stumpy becomes an action hero. The Queen's majestic castle grew closer as Tricky, Stumpy, and Bumpy made their way down the village's cobbled main street. Stumpy had an especially difficult time on the textured road, and Bumpy tripped frequently and was badly bruised. "Listen," said Tricky quietly, so as not to be heard by the tall villagers around them. "Before we go in, let me tell you how it's gonna go down. The Queen's loaded, and she wants this dead broad that we've got stashed at our house, right?"
Right,
said Stumpy and Bumpy.
"It's all supply and demand, see? We've got the supply, so we make the demands."
Tricky began cackling to himself. He looked around at some of the local shopkeepers who were staring.
"What are you looking at?"
he shouted. The villagers jumped and looked away, frightened.
"So," Tricky continued in a whisper, "we're going to go in, and I'm going to do all the talking. Got it?"
Got it, said Stumpy and Bumpy.
"Good. We're going to take this old bag for all she's worth."
After some negotiations with the royal guards, the dwarves were taken to a muscled slave named Huncules, who led them to the throne room. "So," said Huncules, towering over the dwarves, "you have Lily White?"
"Well,"
said Stumpy, happy to be on a smooth surface again,
"we have her corpse."
He laughed darkly.
"Lily White is dead?"
asked Huncules, his face fallen. He could feel his dreams of kinghood slipping away.
"Yep,"
said Tricky happily. They reached the dark throne room where the Queen sat on her throne, surrounded by guards, her head resting on her hand. Huncules handed a herald near the door a note. The herald read it, blew his trumpet, and announced, "Your Majesty the Queen, 3 dwarves from the woods are here to pay tribute and to inquire about the bounty for Lily White."
"The bounty?"
asked the Queen, perking up.
"What do you know about Lily White?"
"We've got her," said Tricky, strutting toward the throne. "Dead!" The Queen blinked.
"Dead?"
"Dead as a doornail," said Tricky.
"But I wanted her alive,"
yelled the Queen, her voice breaking into a whine.
"The sign says wanted, dead or alive,"
said Tricky confidently, pulling out the wanted poster from a pocket and showing it to the Queen.
"That was the old sign before I constructed my torture chambers. This,"
said the Queen, pointing to a large wanted poster tacked to the wall,
"is the new sign."
The sign looked exactly the same, except that dead had been crossed out.
"It's a pity,"
said the Queen slowly.
"I had such wicked tortures planned for her."
She shook her head.
"But no matter. Bring the corpse to me at once, and the reward of 100 gold pieces will be yours." "That's it?"
said an abashed Tricky.
"I could get twice that much from my cousin Dave."
"I specifically specified the reward of 100 gold pieces for her capture," said the Queen.
"That just ain't gonna cut it, sister,"
said Tricky.
"We need more." "Well, dwarf,"
she said the word with a sneer,
"what is it exactly that you want? I warn you not to try my patience." "We want 1/4 of your treasury,"
said Tricky, pacing the throne room like he owned the place, and wagging his finger to emphasize his words.
Or 10% of your income for the next 30 years. Also, we require a castle from which to base and enlarge our dwarfing operations.
Yeah, and I need a pair of legs,
added Stumpy.
Shut up, Stumpy. Let me handle this, said Tricky.
Inspired by Stumpy's extra request, Bumpy added in his high voice,
I need some knee pads and a helmet.
I want to do magic,
growled Stumpy.
No,
yelled Tricky.
Yeah, and I want to fly,
said Bumpy, raising his arms up high over his head.
Who do you think I am? Demanded the Queen. Santa Claus? Now, because of your absurd demands, you'll get nothing. Guards, seize them! Let's get out of here, yelled Tricky.
The 3 dwarves made for the exit, but 2 guards were waiting there. One tried to spear Stumpy. Stumpy dodged and ripped the spear from the guard's hand. He stabbed the spear through both of the guards. Tricky grabbed the spear of the second fallen guard and ran down the hallway, the other dwarves following.
You idiots!
yelled Tricky.
This is all your fault.
I'm sorry, said Bumpy, sprinting to catch up after having fallen again. I just couldn't help myself. After spearing a few more swordsmen, Tricky made a dash along the road leading out of the city. Stumpy followed along at shocking speed for a wooden wheelchair on cobblestones. Bumpy fell so often that he had no chance of keeping up, and had grabbed onto the back of Stumpy's wheelchair and held on as tight as he could. Villagers and guards alike cowered from the armed and fleeing dwarves. In minutes, the dwarves reached the walls of the city and ran through the gates unopposed and fled into the forest. They had escaped. Meanwhile, back in the throne room,
Assemble my personal guard, ordered the Queen. Tonight, the dwarves will pay with their blood, and I will have Lily White's corpse.